it seems superficially unjust to me that they should then be retrospectively pursued for what they were told was an entirely legal option. They definitely need, it needs a proper independent review.
And eliminate retrospection, because when people have acted in good faith under advice and end up subject to injustice, I do think we must uphold this principle of the rule of law. And if some would say they've got away with it, I think sometimes we have to say that while we don't stand on their side, while we accept that it was not Parliament's intent, we respect that there is a price to be paid in upholding the rule of law so that in the end we can preserve human liberty and justice.
HMRC didn't do the job at the time. You still can't tell us how much tax would have been due, and yet ministers have been duped and Parliament has been duped into giving HMRC an unreasonable degree of punitive power.
The Chancellor himself admitted in front of the committee that it was avoidance, not evasion. It's not illegal. And the reality is, I'll be quite frank with you, I'm ashamed of my government as politicians having allowed this to go ahead, and it's time they acted.
The loan charge is the worst form of retrospective taxation.
I'm not asking are HMRC acting within their legal powers. I'm asking are they acting fairly and reasonably, because sometimes the powers that HMRC have got do not require them to act reasonably and fairly.
We have the power to come together cross-party and pass a new clause to right this wrong.
And if we look at what is happening with this loan charge, we can see that all of those principles of taxation, the rules for good application of tax, have been broken.
A path to hell is paved with good intentions. I have no doubt that the loan charge legislation was implemented with good intentions, but it has proved to be a path to hell.
You keep up the pressure. You don't relent. You don't hesitate. You don't back off. You keep pushing. Every single MP, keep reminding them. Keep saying to them, my life, my happiness, my family's future depend on this. Stand up for me. You do that, and I'll stand up for you.
They're having to settle, or being compelled to settle now, when this situation is under active consideration by parliamentarians. When you look at how many MPs have signed the early day motion, how many MPs have signed the letter to the Minister, it is very clear that this is a policy which no longer commands the support of a majority of people in this House.
The mood of the House is clear that nobody here wants to see this loan charge implemented. It's devastating people's lives, and the government needs to act, and act immediately.
Cross-party unity, representing 6 parties in this House.
The HMRC are allowed to go back to 1999 to look at tax records. The records that they can look at include those in otherwise closed years. If that's not retrospective, Mr Speaker, I don't know what it is.
We must insist on the rule of law. Notwithstanding the wicked conduct of promoters, the greater wickedness in the end is to undermine the rule of law, the certainty that comes from knowing that if your actions are lawful at the time they're carried out, they will not subsequently be challenged through retrospective legislation. I feel most strongly about it. I have done throughout my time in Parliament, and I really would urge the government, whatever evils have been done by promoters of these schemes, to abandon the practice of retrospective legislation.
The retrospectivity which undermines basic principles of justice, the devastating impact on people's lives.
The rule of law. And those issues have brought this House together, and we need today to continue that message and make it clear to the Minister and clear to the government we aren't going away till this is put right.
This is a deeply unconservative action by a Conservative government.
What we're debating today is retrospective taxation, and it is abhorrent.
If these arrangements were already illegal when my constituents were being charged with them, why was it necessary to bring in the loan charge in 2017 at all?
The key is Parliament is really coming together, saying there's a real problem, a real challenge here. Treasury, please look at it.
I honestly don't think, Mr. Speaker, that the Minister is really paying attention. These are a lot of comments coming from members behind him, not opposite him. These are people who follow professional advice, declared their arrangements to HMRC, who did nothing. Yet now HMRC are going back and taxing them retrospectively, all the way back to 1999 in some circumstances. The Minister cannot stand at the dispatch box, Mr. Speaker, and just ignore what he is hearing from the benches behind him.
So is he saying then that HMRC are not malevolent, but indiligent, inefficient, ineffective? But if they'd known this and they were mainstream for 20 years, why are they only acting now?
He didn't do the job at the time. HMRC still can't tell us how much money would be involved were it not for the powers that was given to them. And yet HMRC has seen fit to advise ministers to drive a coach and horses through very proper protections for individual citizens from excessive and unreasonable behaviour by tax authorities. That's what's happened.
We are staying to keep fighting the fight. We'll be with you. Take some strength in that. And let's hope we can get some justice. Thank you very much.
The hard fact is that 7 people who are facing challenge or investigation for the loan charge have taken their own lives. He can attribute cause as he wishes. The fact is also that this distress has been caused by the incompetence historically of the HMRC, and then by the willingness of ministers subsequently to use retrospective action in taxation.
Let me tell this minister this, who is a good and honourable man. When this many members of this House from across the House come together in a single cause, you better take action.
In 2005, my right honourable friend, the Chancellor, said, "Certainty and transparency are the hallmarks of a fair, effective and competitive tax system. A taxpayer is entitled to know with certainty what he may or may not do in planning his tax affairs," end quote. And this is why I object to retrospective legislation which undermines the rule of law.
Is it true to say that HMRC needed a legal power to tax loans made as far back as 1999 because of its own failures to open inquiries or raise assessments at that proper time?
Why ask for 20 years retrospective payment for something which was and is legal?
They are being treated unfairly universally, and if there are wrongdoers who are caught up in this because of your incompetence as an organisation, not you individually, I should emphasise, but HMRC's incompetence at the time, that's their good luck. But why should people who have done what they think is right, have taken the advice and followed the rules, submitted their tax returns, why should they now face tax bills in excess of £100,000, £200,000?
It's for the sole purpose of avoiding tax. Well, I have news for the House. I've got at least a couple of ISAs which are there for the sole purpose of avoiding tax. Are they now illegal? Is that the criteria we should apply? Well, plainly not. Plainly not.
And so that any loan charge will only come into effect after royal assent of the 2017 Finance Act.
I think HMRC have simply got it wrong.
At least 4 of the constituents who've been to see me have said that they were told by their companies that unless they signed these new forms of contractual relationships, they would not continue to work for those companies. Given that, shouldn't HMRC be pursuing the companies and not the individuals?
A tax policy that is destroying families, homes, mental health and even lives.
It's retrospective and it undermines the cornerstone of taxation, that a government should not seek to impose or increase a tax charge on income earned, gains realised or transactions concluded at a time before the legislation was announced.
These advance payment notices are being relentlessly pursued by HMRC with no independent right of appeal, and I think that's just does not seem to be playing fair.
They found that the Public Bill Committee for the Finance No. 2 Act 2017 did not adequately scrutinise the loan charge. Now, that's incredibly important in something that's going to be retrospective. They didn't properly scrutinise.
Trust in the rule of law and our democratic system is at stake.
We've also had a disturbing number of reports of individual HMRC officers telling taxpayers they should apply for mortgages or loans, but not tell the lender that the money will be used to pay a tax bill. Why? Because, of course, that's contrary to tax law.
What is happening is wrong.
So my view is very simple. This should not be retrospective at all before 2017. At all. Because there's no reason for it whatsoever given the behaviour of the HMRC.
This is not a partisan issue, this is an issue of justice. And also, in politics, it's an issue of justice, it's an issue of honour. It's a promise that has to be kept, and keep it we will.
Now, under the Taxes Administration Act, Section 9 of 1970, we have been giving taxpayers in that situation total protection from the HRC coming back to them. That's been for decades. Indeed, we've signed international conventions to say that is the way individuals should be treated. And here we are going back on that.
And furthermore, the Rangers Supreme Court case, which remains the position in law, individuals are not liable, their employers are, yet HMRC is misinterpreting the outcome of that case.
The ministers and HMRC don't realise that some of you had your tax affairs closed. And by law, going back to the 1970 Taxes Management Act, and indeed international agreements, they can't reopen those years.
No! They can't!
And any attempt to do so would be a breach of, I think, constitutional principle.
What we haven't had is any practical information from HMRC to protect our constituents, which I think really underpins the attitudinal problem at HMRC, which is covering HMRC's backsides but not doing enough practically to help people who are actually on the brink of financial ruin.
I fear that this policy is another example how those at the very highest echelons of our government seem to have a tin ear to the good people they represent.
The power to tax is the power to destroy. If you're in your pension years and somebody comes to you and says, I want £100,000, please, then it's a destructive, it will destroy your life. It's a matter of justice. I mean, it's not just a matter of money. It's a matter of justice. It's also a matter of destroying people's lives. The hard fact is that 7 people who are facing challenge or investigation for the loan charge have taken their own lives. He can attribute cause as he wishes. The fact is also that this distress has been caused by the incompetence historically of the HMRC and then by the willingness of ministers subsequently to use retrospective action in taxation. Now, is the government going to give up on the premise of using retrospective taxation in the future, or does it fall to this House to pass laws that will stop them doing so in future?
HMRC allowed these schemes to run for a very long period of years and then declared them retrospective all the way back to the beginning, which is why the potential losses are so great.
The fact that this issue has brought the House together, and I want to talk a little bit about that because I think it's the power of this House to stop the executive on this matter.
People who were consultants to HMRC and who are now being faced with a loan charge.
The nature of the retrospection, which is the issue that's caused me, as well as my constituents' cases, to be so passionate about this point. It's that cross-party nature and the depth of that support that should make the Minister think today. And they need to know that when this House comes together, the government listens. And it's our constitutional job to make the government listen. And when there's level support and it doesn't, that is an outrage to this House.
The distress is very, very, very real.
I asked them if they could find any example ever on the statute books of a government passing a law to override those taxpayer protections, and they could not.
HMRC were aware of these promoters, yet none have been investigated and prosecuted. Why is this?
And those open inquiries have lasted 4 years. The HMRC doing nothing, as the honourable gentleman said in a second. And surely this is HMRC incompetence, not taxpayer mistakes. And so they're now paying because HMRC couldn't administer the tax system over that period. and have tried and failed to get the law right. I'm sorry, you can't come now and penalise our constituents with tax bills of tens of thousands of pounds because HMRC couldn't do their job properly. That's not acceptable.
From Jim Hara, who is the second permanent secretary at HMRC, and he says, and I quote as follows: "Among the disguised remuneration users, there are undoubtedly people who have liabilities for years where under normal rules we do not now have accessing rights. In our settlement opportunity, we have asked these people to settle for all years, including the years for which we do not have these accessing rights. If they choose not to do that, I can't make them settle voluntarily for these years."
There is a sense, one witness told us, that HMRC is aiming to collect the maximum amount of tax rather than the right amount of tax.
And if we look at what is happening with this loan charge, we can see that all of those principles of taxation, the rules for good application of tax, have been broken.
Do not understand why the HMRC now thinks it's fair to go back over records up to 20 years old and unexpectedly ask for sums of tens and hundreds of thousands of pounds of ordinary hard-working people. It completely baffles me.
And one of the things that I will pursue generally after this experience, Madam Deputy Speaker, is the use of open tax inquiries by HMRC. This goes against the whole spirit of the 1970 Taxes Management and Tax Administration Act, and frankly against the spirit of the way the rule of law should operate. And I believe on all sides we stand to defend the rule of law, and when we see an abuse of it, we should get angry.
When a unanimous voice comes from so many benches, and with passion, that this is not a party political issue.
The approach being taken circumvents taxpayer protections.
But I've had people almost in tears in my surgery over a tax matter. That's never happened before in 20 years.
We have lots of people who have come to me in desperation, whose families are appalled. These are decent people, people who started businesses, some who were working even in the health service. These are decent people who did what they believed to be right. This was checked with HMRC. HMRC at no point over this period ever said that this should not be, they should not undertake this.
To vote this tyrannous legislation down. And so the reply to that amendment in the Finance Bill is simply not good enough. It is wrong. This is a breach in the rule of law.
And for many of those people, it was not financially particularly advantageous because they paid a huge fee for the administration of that scheme, 18% being the standard charge. So add that to the taxes in which they were paid. They weren't taking home more, and they had every reason to think that they were working in an approved situation.
What's the time, Boris? Time for the independent review. When? Now! I am the Treasury spokesman of the Liberal Democrats. So I know what my party's policy is on it. We need to ask Sajid Javid, what is the Tory party policy on it? We need to ask John McDonnell, what is the Labour Party's policy on it? And we need to use this electoral opportunity to get the fairness that you and your families and your friends and your work colleagues all deserve.
The HMRC has got to learn from history. It appears to me to be acting vindictively, because it didn't get its way a few years ago on IR35, because people have found legitimate ways around it. It's coming back and acting in an outrageously draconian way, and this House has got to say no. Mr. Speaker, an unusual thing happened last night. Conservative MPs and opposition MPs united. Leavers and Remainers united. United to back my proposal for review of retrospection in a law called the loan charge, which offends against the rule of law and has caused misery to tens of thousands of people.
The cultural attitude of HMRC, its leadership, and the communications it prioritises with MPs says rather a lot about HMRC's focus on this.
The loan charge is, however, retrospective in its effect.
One of the most iniquitous aspects of this case for me is the fact that the promoters of these schemes are not being pursued.
And to stop the unfair loan charge.
Yeah.
It is causing real hardship and distress to law-abiding taxpayers. This week it's reported that the 7th person has taken their own life because of the loan charge. Minister, how many more people are going to take their lives before you scrap the loan charge?
It affects a range of people, from IT contractors to oil and gas workers, locum doctors, social workers, nurses.
It is not just, it is not fair for them to be pursued retrospectively.
I think it was a US Supreme Court Judge Marshall who once said the power to tax is the power to destroy. And this, I'm afraid, is a very good example of that. A tax policy that is destroying families, homes, mental health and even lives.
And HMRC is merely making up for the fact that it has been lax in pursuing these particular cases where it thinks there is something that it ought to investigate. It shouldn't be throwing the burden of its own incompetence, I might say, onto the taxpayer.
So HMRC were aware of what was happening. There was no attempt to hide here. So characterising it as tax avoidance retrospectively seems wholly unjust.
Because I'm afraid that particularly in the government party and certainly among the sort of officials and culture around Treasury and HMRC, there are closed minds.
HMRC knew about these schemes for many years, and year after year, in successive tax returns in individual cases and collectively signed off those returns, but also failed to take action even then against promoters.
HMRC contractors now being pursued by HMRC due to the loan charge.
And I see from today's Financial Times the rather disturbing news that HMRC spent 26 million last year on private debt collectors, up from 6 million in 2014. I find that in this context a rather sinister number.
HMRC coerced contractors by threatening us with Armageddon if we didn't declare.
Both notices prioritise fast recovery of tax revenue over fairness for taxpayers and, in my view, are a tax on access to justice.
How does an ordinary lay person forecast what HMRC will decide in 10 or 20 years' time?
If his government maintains that these arrangements were illegal when entered into, why has his government done absolutely nothing about the advisers that recommended them?
And notwithstanding the trouble of retrospective law in general, 18 years is a very long time to disapprove of something and not say you don't approve it and not act to fix it.
So we now learn from the Minister that HMRC knew that these schemes were inappropriate from the outset. So is he saying then that HMRC are not malevolent but indiligent, inefficient, ineffective? But if they'd known this and they were mainstream for 20 years, why are they only acting now?
Because we're not going away.
This House has the chance and the opportunity to put this wrong right. It's deeply unfair that we seek to do this retrospectively. It absolutely violates the core principles of the rule of law. And I couldn't agree more with colleagues who've already expressed that frustration. I think that this particular measure is disgraceful. If I can go even further to say, I think it's dishonourable and it should be stopped.
I think nearly 50% of those that are liable for this loan charge have not had any communication with HMRC since June of 2016.
The writing's on the wall.
All of a sudden we changed the law and retrospectively ruined the lives of many people.
The retrospective element, which is particularly disturbing.
In the last 20 years, it seems to me that the exercise of their judgment has become more and more oriented on cash and less on justice.
The problem is, as many members of this House have said, the HMRC have been very slow to react to this whole matter. Dawn Primarolo, when she was then Postmaster General, and as far back as 2004, said the government was going to legislate to stop these schemes. The government legislated again in 2011, and it wasn't until the Finance Act in 2017 that this loophole was closed.
One of the great iniquities here is that HMRC knew what was going on, but didn't actually do anything about it. with expedition and with decisiveness at the time.
Absolutely. And now, of course, they're pursuing an aggressive policy which, on any analysis, is retrospective.
HMRC seems to be prioritising the recovery of tax revenue over justice.
That it's the little people who get really no understanding from HMRC.
We need to make sure that every single candidate standing that election alleges a review and to stop any retrospective taxation that is so unfair.
The fundamental unfairness that many of us feel is that HMRC are going after the easiest targets, namely the individuals, rather than those who may or may not be most culpable.
Stop the unfair loan charge.
But the problem is the government, time and time again, has made it much more difficult. The classic issue in recent times has been the loan charge. I set up the all-party group on the loan charge because I thought it was a scandal. Not closing tax avoidance. Tax avoidance was right to be closed. But the retrospective nature of the loan charge, which basically went back to some people 20 years, even years where their tax affairs have been closed. No government can claim it's on the side of a flexible workforce of contractors and self-employed when it does that to them. It was a disgrace, it is a disgrace.
And I fear that there has been a complete breakdown in trust between the people and the authorities that are responsible for upholding the rule of law.
Did HMRC take reasonable and diligent steps to identify and notify the debt and to attempt to recover it at the time? Because a lot of other civil debt cases, if the person who's owed the money does nothing about it for years and years and years and then comes back years later and tries to claim back the money with interest, they find it's time barred and they can't do it. Why aren't HMRC subject to the same restriction?
Some of the language used by HMRC just seems totally tone deaf.
HMRC knew about these arrangements for decades and was slow in taking legal action and inept in shutting them down.
There used to be, Madam Deputy Speaker, an old legal saying that you'll recall, he who comes to equity must have clean hands. The person who seeks the redress of the courts must have acted in good faith. I fear the Revenue have not acted in good faith in this matter in relation to my constituents or taxpayers generally. There is an aggressive attitude towards tax collection which has gone beyond the bounds of fairness.
The biggest problem with this is the retrospective nature of it.
We owe a duty to our constituents to have some certainty from the state in the taxes they pay.
We are all appalled, and all MPs are appalled at the stories of from constituents of how HMRC are behaving. And, you know, I find it unbelievable in a public body. Unbelievable. You know, and I have to deal, on behalf of constituents with the DWP and with the Home Office Immigration Service. And I cannot believe, and they are bad enough, but HMRC's behaviour and processes are, you know, stratospherically appalling.
In this House, if Lord Judge says it's wrong, it usually is wrong.
And frankly, the laxitude with which the Inland Revenue has dealt with pursuing the matters originally and the arbitrary nature in which they have acted thereafter. I endorse the calls for a pause to the scheme, for an independent inquiry and for the retrospective element to be removed. It is simply not just.
And HMRC has instead targeted the little people.
So the government's priorities seem clear. They won't go after the enablers.
Clearly the loophole had to be closed, but not in the retrospective fashion that has hit so many of my constituents. So let me ask the Minister specifically, if these arrangements were already illegal when my constituents were being charged with them, why was it necessary to bring in the loan charge in 2017 at all?
And the behaviour of some, particularly from the government side, making people feel like criminals.
Chillingly adding that it only considers bankrupting individuals as a last resort. Well, that's reassuring, really.
It's absolutely ridiculous that Her Majesty's Treasury have downgraded the promised review into the loan charge to a report as agreed by the House provisionally.
People who will never have the resources to pay back this money, never have the resources. Doesn't matter if it's 2 years, 5 years, 7 years, 10 years. They'll just never have it. People who are under this policy now are suffering mental strain day in, day out. They are not people who are ever going to find £20,000. And to say to them, you've got 5 years to pay, if you are, as one of my constituents is, on a minimum pension, is meaningless.
Well, and you should come down like a ton of bricks on those tax advisors, and so should their professional bodies.
Why did it take HMRC 20 years to take official action? Why did HMRC not email or write to loan users over the last 20 years?
Since when has it constituted an abuse for a citizen, rich or poor, to seek to rely on law laid down, indeed laid down annually, by Parliament? It's a very strange concept.
Now this really is the criminal aspect of this, that you declare a scheme and then 20 years later or 10 years later they come back and say, sorry, we haven't closed your year, you can pay now.
The Treasury has consistently taken the view that this is technically not retrospective. But our constituents don't live in the technical world, they live in the real world.
This issue is causing severe emotional and financial distress, something which I think HMRC are neglecting, are not taking note of, are behaving as though they don't understand that it's about real people's lives.
Sir John Thompson explained to this committee that the loan charge was not retrospective because people had 3 years to get their affairs in order before the loan charge kicked in, and if they did so, they wouldn't have to pay the loan charge. But doesn't it feel very retrospective if getting their affairs in order means people having to pay tax for years that would otherwise be time barred, as was referred to earlier, so-called years that are not protected? How's that justified?
I also worry that HMRC are behaving in a fashion towards taxpayers which is frankly new and in many cases tax advisors say unprecedented. And I have to say to my honourable friend that I also think that the retrospectivity is deeply questionable.
By HMRC not speaking out and by not acting to prevent these loan schemes being used for 18 years, while they maybe did not give explicit approval, they certainly gave implicit acceptance.
Government should be taking far sterner action against promoters than individuals who were misled. HMRC, in terms of how they've conducted themselves, have fallen woefully short of the standards that we should expect, both in terms of timely communication with taxpayers, but also in the way that they have misled, and I do think HMRC have misled legislators in the calling for and the legislating for the loan charge that we see.
It isn't going to help the Treasury to recoup losses over the longer term if the loan charge causes businesses to go under next year.
On the delays, on the lack of natural justice, on the fact that you don't have access to the basic processes such as tribunal.
The government and HMRC takes the well-being of customers very seriously. HMRC's teams are trained to identify and help vulnerable customers, and where appropriate, refer them to organisations such as Samaritans in Mind. Let that sink in, my lords. The government's solution is to refer people to the Samaritans. I am clear that if a bank said that was their policy towards vulnerable customers, the FCA's response would be immediate enforcement action.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Like many members of this House, I have constituents who have been egregiously affected by this. I think the Minister's response is unacceptable.
Disproportionate powers and an overtly aggressive culture.
The HMRC are pursuing the easy targets.
But virtually everyone that we talked to said, if I had any clue that HMRC was troubled by this, that of course I would have stepped away from it.
They are being tacked retrospectively for something that was technically allowed at the time. What's more, the 20-year range proposed is usually reserved for blatant acts of criminality.
And the architects and advocates of these schemes are the people that the Treasury should be pursuing with vigour and determination.
And you're not going after these people?
Well, the difficulty is that unless they've done something that's actually illegal, it is very hard, and of course we're not seeking in any case to pass retrospective legislation that would allow us to go after those promoters.
Although HMRC says that it understands vulnerable customers, I mean, there is plenty of evidence that people now have sold businesses, They've sold their homes, they've gone bankrupt. That families have split up because I'm afraid money can become very significant in shattering a family structure, particularly when somebody has to dissolve their whole pension pot in order to meet this very large bill that comes in over 1 year. And being told that it could be spread over 3 years is pretty meaningless. The number is so fantastically large.
Political opposition to the government's approach is growing.
For HMRC to actually acknowledge that we must now have an independent inquiry into this issue led by an experienced tax judge.
HMRC have always said that these arrangements were unacceptable, but I haven't seen anything prior to 2016 to suggest that was the case.
In reality, the retrospective effect actually displaces all the protections that taxpayers are given by Parliament in terms of getting certainty for their affairs.
The point is, it's clearly retrospective.
I worry that we seem to be pursuing these least able to pay, the little people.
I note also that only 1.5 pages of the 56-page report was dedicated to action against organisations promoting DR schemes, which is telling in itself.
When you take into account, firstly, the failure of HMRC to take effective action for all those years, and secondly, the fundamental protections that every taxpayer should expect.
Government's loan charge and its retrospective implementation has left many people who were unaware of these schemes with eye-watering bills.
I agree with all of those who have raised these extraordinary issues of the denial of rights to appeal, accelerated payment notices and follower notices to tax tribunals, and totally object to the disproportionate penalties for appealing follow notices and GAR decisions. Justice is fundamental, and I wish HMRC would understand that and take that on board.
Indeed, that is precisely what is meant by the government response at page 9, that this regime provides the taxpayer, I'm paraphrasing it, with an opportunity to settle the dispute without the application of penalties. That is a pretty subtle threat, isn't it? Bedecked as it may seem to be as an inducement, it'll be in your interest to do as we tell you.
In the library briefing, Mr David Richardson, the Director of Customer Strategy, HMRC, to the Treasury Select Committee said there were 105,000 cases, 80,000 of which are unresolved.
But you can be assured that you have the support of a lot of MPs in Parliament.
This measure is not expected to have a material impact on family formation, stability or breakdown, and I find that statement unbelievable.
It's iniquitous that you are now suffering. How can working people who live on the money they get each month and are in a system like this then be told to pay back thousands and thousands of pounds like that? It's wrong, ladies and gentlemen. I will help all I can.
I was horrified that some of the 70 individuals who submitted evidence to the APPG, some of them, I'm not sure how many, have actually been called by HMRC with messages left on their answer phones. It's been picked up by business partners and family members who had no idea that there was an issue that's at large, and we do need an answer from HMRC.
There's something unbecoming about the nature with which this government is kind of flying the plane when making up the rules as they go along. Like, these are just changing the rules halfway through. If we don't like the rules, change them.
But today in the Times, there is a report on tax inspectors actually putting pressure on people to pay up ahead of time, even beyond those that have been agreed.
And to take action now, after 20 years, is totally unfair, defies all laws of natural justice.
We have to accept that they are not to blame for implementing the loan charge, which was passed by Parliament, by the House of Commons. And this requires, to deal with this, requires a change in the law. Does the opposition support a change in the law?
The answer to that question is categorically yes.
Clearly, this is an issue of huge importance to those facing a significant increase in their tax bill, and the government must act quickly following the events that have occurred recently in relation to the personal impact.
However,
They have sent us a statement which we're incredibly grateful for. They say the loan charge is designed to tackle contrived tax avoidance schemes where individuals were paid in loans, often through offshore trusts that they never had to repay. These payments have always been taxable and HMRC has never approved these schemes. We are encouraging people to settle now before the loan charge comes in. HMRC will do everything to support users to settle their tax affairs in the most manageable way possible. Well, I have one reaction to that. And that's the sound of me screwing up the statement. It is utterly ridiculous.
Look, these people are not sort of pocket Al Capones out to defraud the system. They're self-employed professional people contracting to different entities, paying their own pensions without the protections of regular employment.
The House of Lords Committee found little evidence of action taken against those who promote disguised remuneration schemes.
That when there is prima facie evidence that a class of taxpayers, maybe in this case 50,000 strong, are being unfairly treated and seriously disadvantaged, with very serious consequences in some cases, the responsible minister surely needs to put that right or take responsibility for it. Hiding behind officials just won't do.
I will at least, and I suspect many others in this House, will start to pursue a right in law for every citizen that limits the extent to which the state, and particularly HMRC, can take any retroactive action whatsoever against persons.
And of the 6 promoters HMRC has been investigating, and 6 others, we hear that charges will not be pursued because they didn't breach DOTUS. Only the users of the schemes will be pursued. And as far as I know, well, no one has yet gone and asked the employers. And that, of course, would include ultimately HMRC.
Is the retrospective nature of this and the disproportionate approach being taken by HMRC. The people I represent are very reasonable. They would be happy to come to an arrangement with the HMRC, but the HMRC seems to want to bankrupt its debtors as opposed to get some return from them.
In going back to 1999, the loan charge is retrospective.
I just want to be clear that I'm the Economic Secretary, the Financial Secretary wanted to be here.
The Chancellor writes, finally, I'd like to clarify my comments to the committee in reference to the use of disguised remuneration schemes, which I, the Chancellor, described as tax evasion. He writes, I should have said tax avoidance.
My Lords, the charge on disguised remuneration loans has been criticised by those who say that it ought to be the employer who has to pay the tax that is outstanding. I agree.
Say that the revenue is going after the easy targets, the people who really can't defend themselves. There was a lot of dispute legally about whether these loans were in fact pay and whether they were taxable. The government simply passed a law less than a year ago, last November, which said we have the right to collect what they call a loan charge on this money as if it was pay and as if it was taxable. And that can go back to 1999.
And the other legal observation I make is this, that of Mrs Justice Whipple in a revenue case in 2015. Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs' primary duty to collect tax is not a trump card that prevails over all other considerations. Instead, it is a broad duty exercised by means of a wide managerial discretion, within which is embedded the obligation to treat taxpayers fairly. My constituents as taxpayers, having had years gone by when the Revenue had the opportunity to raise the concerns with them but did nothing, and therefore their bills have run up, and then suddenly are hit with arbitrary figures, have not been treated fairly.
Tens of thousands of people and their families will face the huge cost, both physical and emotional, of the loan charge. And HMRC are yet to show any regard to the enormous pain that this legislation has already inflicted on thousands of people across the country.
Only a single promoter of a loan charge scheme had been successfully prosecuted, and that is Hierax, but on the grounds that it breached DOTAS rules, not because it sold the schemes to people. And indeed, it's been allowed to keep its 18% fees that were charged to users. Hydrax's penalty appears to be a requirement that they disclose the users' names to HMRC so that they can be pursued.
What's clear is the retrospective loan charge is causing huge pain and upset as people are threatened with their livelihoods and homes.
I have found the government's response to this paper alarmingly negative.
The Inland Revenue statement to the Public Accounts Committee 2 weeks ago said that among the disguised remuneration users, there are undoubtedly people who have liabilities for years where, under the normal rules, we do not now have assessing rights. We have asked those people to settle voluntarily.
We are looking at thousands of bankruptcies, family breakups, suicide attempts, mental illness, unemployment, loss of abode and more. This is a catalogue of human suffering and misery.
HMRC's actions are also self-defeating, as this will undoubtedly cause ordinary working people, push them into bankruptcy, restricting HMRC's ability to recover tax liabilities, which doesn't seem very sensible.
There is something seriously wrong.
Now, HMRC's approach to the loan charge has, I believe, been punitive rather than proportionate.
Despite there being a review, the loan charge remains in place, and HMRC are continuing to pursue people for advance payment notices, of which there is no right of appeal. So this clearly goes against the spirit of the review.
They knew full well about some of these loan schemes for a very long time, and then subsequently a political decision was made to call them in, and that political decision actually could have been taken much, much earlier, so they wouldn't have seen some of this damage, and that creates a lot of uncertainty within the wider tax system, which actually is very corrosive.
I'm deeply concerned at some of the tactics that have been employed.
The Chancellor will know that one of the fiscal policies this government has, which is fundamentally wrong, is the loan charge retrospective taxes on our constituents. Whether it's one death, no deaths, 7 deaths, families are being destroyed because of this retrospective charge, and surely we should put a stop to it now.
A removal of the retrospective nature of the charge, certainly not going back further than 2017 when the charges were first announced.
Mr Speaker, I have had heartbreaking meetings with constituents from Hastings regarding the loan charge. Tragic, sad stories about the destruction of families and of their finances.
Now, we understand HMRC have used behaviour change specialists in pursuing the loan charge, which may explain the aggressive and opaque nature of their communications. Regular use of HMRC of the phrase asking people to, quote, put their tax affairs right, unquote, is clearly part of this strategy of forcing people to feel and accept guilt for wrongdoing.
It will lead to bankruptcy, whether that's what the government intends or not.
It actually smacks of trying to maximise income from the softest targets with the minimum of costs.
I will keep making the points to government. I will still keep fighting.
It's absolutely ridiculous that Her Majesty's Treasury have downgraded the promised review into the loan charge to a report as agreed by the House provisionally.
Current Chancellor of the Exchequer in 2005 said a taxpayer is entitled to be protected from retrospective or retroactive taxation.
There are a number of people in this situation whose employers came up with these schemes.
I do look forward to a cross-party backbench new clause to the Finance Bill, which I think, on the basis of the numbers here, would stand a very good chance of passing the House.
Although in a recent parliamentary question, the Treasury Minister gave a new figure of 50,000 individuals affected. The government anticipates that some of these individuals will become insolvent as a result.
Why is it necessary to go back into non-protected years? Because people feel deeply aggrieved. And you said, people want to come forward and settle, but many of the people I've spoken to, the reason they're running scared from this, because this is life-changing amounts of money. They just can't see a way out. And it's easy for me, in the comfort of a surgery, to say, well, didn't you see this coming? But it might have been 10, 15 years ago, and the sums are absolutely enormous, particularly in the oil and gas industry, where a lot of them were working offshore and making very significant amounts of money. And their circumstances now are very changed. One of them earns £12,000 a year driving a delivery van for Tesco. I mean, the chap is facing complete ruin.
The reality
reality is that for many people caught up in this loan charge scandal, they were effectively missold in many cases, schemes that they were told had been QC vetted and were perfectly legal, and that, I think, is underlined by the fact that there are not actually criminal charges being pursued against any of these individuals who sold these. Isn't it time for this fresh minister to now take a fresh look at the Treasury's approach on all of this?
The fact that the minister has treated this committee with what, I'm being less courteous than Lord Carr, with what I regard as a contempt, with a contemptuous disregard for serious issues.
It's a massive injustice. It's an injustice that has to be put right. We know it's cost lives. We know it's ruined many, many, many other lives. And we know that a tax system which is not a just system can't stand.
Once we've dealt with the people who are not a couple of £1,000, not the people that were on £30,000 a year, who are most of the cases we're talking about here, the people who set up companies who were raking in profits of £1 million a year and paying hee-haw and tax, they're the people that HMRC should be going for.
From Don, who says, this tax business is a disaster. The NHS told temp nurses they would only be employed if they came through an umbrella agency who treated them as self-employed. Then HMRC told them what they had done was illegal. Amazing. And that's happened across the board. Now, any tax avoidance scheme, surely we have to accept that if the HMRC thinks it's wrong, well, they can then stop it. And they can say no one can sign up to this sort of thing in future. But you surely can't go after people who've done something that's perfectly legal.
What is surprising about all of this is many of the schemes were promoted by employers with deep pockets, and we found no evidence that HMRC was showing the same enthusiasm in pursuing either the employers or the promoters of the schemes.
And I'm really serious. I don't think the whips could have got this many people in here on a Thursday on a one-line whip. But what has driven us here is our constituents. It's our job. It's what this Parliament was set up to do, to defend the little guy against the big guy. And the big guy's the government, and we will defend the little guy.
That some blame must be ascribed to the Inland Revenue, to the HMRC, for lying low and saying nothing for so long.
In back taxes for 20 years. I personally think that it's completely iniquitous. I don't understand why the government aren't going to apparently change their minds on this. They won't even justify it. That I think really sticks in people's craw.
But if HMRC tells you that if you challenge our analysis of this problem, and you lose, and we can pay you, as your accountants will advise you, a huge penalty, what's your reaction likely to be? It turns HMRC into judge in its own cause.
Their argument against all that advice was that it wasn't retrospective because it was a charge on the loan as of now, the outstanding loan. Now, this is interesting because they've never before proven that loanable income. That was the whole point of this whole debacle. Moreover, that loan was taken out in the past. So you might not call it retrospective, you might call it retroactive. Frankly, it's the same thing for the ordinary person.
My Lords, I've spent a long time on the loan charge because it is something I feel strongly about in the way in which it demonstrates lack of fairness and being a blot on our tax system.
HMRC does not appear to be targeting the companies who were, and in some cases still are, providing these tax planning schemes, but rather the individuals who use them. Sadly, there are still people joining these schemes today unaware of the impact it's likely to have on them.
As my right honourable friend knows, those affected by the devastating loan charge have welcomed the independent review, but feel it would be better conducted by a tax judge. Does the Minister agree, and would he also agree that a suitable outcome from the review would be only to apply the loan charge from when it was introduced in 2016, not apply it retrospectively?
They represent 100,000 families, including nurses, doctors, teachers, social workers and contractors. And because of retrospective taxation by this government, going back 20 years, many of these families will lose their home, forced into bankruptcy, and I'm afraid some will commit suicide. That cannot have been the intention of the government.
One gets the impression that Mr Osborne basically said to HMRC, I need the money, get it in, and at the same time cut the numbers, and therefore perhaps some corners have been cut.
But what on earth is being done to tackle these people promoting these schemes?
The real villains here are the companies who missold these schemes in the first place.
7 needless deaths, 7 families tragically left to deal with the consequences. And yet the companies who have promoted these schemes, companies such as AML, are getting away scot-free.
My understanding is that the Glasgow Rangers case, on which the 2019 loan charge is based, concluded that the tax liability fell on the employers. This raises the question as to why the HMRC are not pursuing those client organisations, agencies and umbrella groups who have benefited significantly from setting up these arrangements.
The loan charge should apply from Royal Assent onwards. In other words, it should be prospective. This is a case I've made many times and not retroactive or retrospective.
Can we imagine our reaction if any other government department or minister tried to obtain the power to impose a financial penalty on anyone who had the temerity to take it or him or her to court? We'd be horrified.
We're going back, in some cases, 20 years, though, and demanding, therefore, huge bills from people, which in many cases they just can't afford.
We do not believe that the government has done enough to pursue third parties who promoted such schemes. They must surely take a share of responsibility in many cases for what took place. The report published by the government suggested that only 10 organisations are facing legal action for promoting their use, and this seems like a very small number compared to the 50,000 individuals being chased.
This does feel off. It feels like a retrospective tax grab.
People were told that they could work on particular jobs if they took on this way of remuneration.
Since most of the employers in these cases were local government, that obviously would pay any bill that HMRC thought was appropriate. Central government departments, who would also pay, HMRC itself, that's collecting there ought to be quite simple, that's and various public bodies such as the BBC. Is he now giving a reassurance to all those who have received a loan charge demand but who were working for those public entities that they at the very least will not be pursued because it's their employer who will be paying?
I think the safest thing I can do is to repeat what I just said. HMRC will seek to collect the loan charge from employers in the first instance and will only pursue individuals for the tax due where it cannot reasonably do so from the employer. For example, if the employer is no longer in existence or is offshore. Now, the BBC is still there and it is not offshore.
What more can be done to tackle the promoters of loan schemes who were making assurances to workers and businesses, even though the Treasury had made it clear that these schemes were unacceptable? Shouldn't they be brought to book?
He did make a promise. We have to try to keep him to that promise.
So that's the House of Lords view. It was very, very critical. For a House of Lords report, it was an incredibly critical report.
They have very little sense of the world of contracting and self-employment. They have very little understanding of how people made those decisions and what their, what their capacities and capabilities were, and they have very little understanding of what the impact of their decisions are.
This means that the legislation is not retrospective because the legislation sets out the intention of Parliament.
Employers have forced these people into the schemes that action should be taken against, and those financial advisors that sold them the schemes in the first place.
Lords, I'm deeply conscious I haven't done justice to the many serious questions that have been raised, and I'm already over time. Could I, in conclusion, thank noble lords who have spoken for their contributions to this stimulating debate.
I'm quite sure the House would be very, very willing to extend considerable injury time to the noble lord if he would be prepared to tell us not just what the boilerplate says, but what he actually thinks.
What feels wrong, I think, to some of us is that this equivalent effort does not seem to be put into pursuing the promoters of these schemes, or indeed the employers themselves, and that the entire weight of this of recovering this so-called tax gap is falling only on the employees. That doesn't seem to feel right.
When I asked a parliamentary written question on the approach and the assessment the Treasury has made of the impact of this loan charge on the mental health of the people subject to pursuit now, the answer was, to put it mildly, less than satisfactory.
To the Minister, that I don't want to keep stressing the issue of suicides, but in the one case that I am personally aware of, that is he aware that HMRC is now pursuing the heirs for the loan charge?
It's an absolute disgrace that hospital cleaners, locum doctors, nurses, council workers, social workers, people who work hard for the public on low or moderate pay were recruited into these schemes by tax advisors and bogus umbrella companies. And it's an absolute disgrace that the government is determined just to take on these individuals rather than those who facilitated this avoidance for profit, those who knew fully what they were doing and did it anyway.
AML and its director, Doug Barrowman, appeared to have moved away with no consequences whatsoever. In fact, they were boasting that the HMRC are not pursuing them for any assets or unpaid taxes.
Committee stage of the finance bill in the other place. I think I'm right in saying there was a speech from the Minister, a speech from the opposition, and two other speeches, and none of the issues about retrospection, etc., were raised. I think I'm also right in saying that in the other place, there's been an early day motion signed by many, many members, and several debates, including one in Westminster Hall, none of which has altered the government's response in any way.
Well, I'm sure that if my noble friend and I had been on the finance bill at the time, we might have raised some of the issues that he has now raised.
And yet they are not pursuing those client organisations, agencies and umbrella groups who have benefited from setting up these arrangements.
One of the things that we've changed on the Economic Affairs Committee is when we produce reports, it's not just to move on to the next issue, but to come back to those reports and review what progress has been made. And I'm sure on the loan charge there will be further work.
Let us make sure that our cause is not forgotten. Let's make sure that our cause puts politicians and would-be politicians on the line to make a promise that they will keep. Thank you very much.
I have to say, I don't like it. It feels wrong.
Unjust